So
we're all on Zoom, so we're all safe.
True.
And it's just connecting to Facebook now. Here we go. Beautiful. So hello everyone in Facebook land. I believe we are live there now. Hello to everyone starting to join also on Zoom. I know most people are over in Facebook, and I'll be monitoring all of you. We've just got about a minute to the hour, so we'll hang tight for a moment and then get underway. But welcome back to the Superhuman Summit. Those of you who have already been online and participating, I hope you enjoyed speaker one. Wasn't Jade awesome? She was the bomb. She was coming from the Gold Coast with the beach behind her. Lots of fun. All right, let's get underway. With a few seconds left to go. Welcome everyone. Before we get underway, it's always great to just take a moment to pay our respects and know that we are drawing on the wisdom of tribes, elders, and people who have gone before us. There is also much to do in the future ahead of us, and part of what this summit is all about is that blend between science and spirituality. And how do we, as dear little humans, solve some of the biggest problems and challenges in the world around us? How do we adapt and be prepared for what the future may bring? And today we have an awesome guest. Speaker number 2 is with us. Dr. Richard Claydon is in the house. How are you, Richard?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you today?
Awesome to hear your voice. And Richard's coming to us from Hong Kong. So it's lovely to have international guests and people from all around the world are watching as well today. Richard is an interesting man, shall I say, and I had the pleasure of interviewing him at our first summit earlier this year when really the coronavirus pandemic had just hit and the world was in a bit of discombobulation. And I found Richard's talk then super interesting and valuable, and he has some really unique insights, and I think a very particular way of looking at the world that is quite different and not what you see everywhere. And so we were super keen to bring him back on today. He's a bit of a misbehaviorist, which I love that idea, and an anti-fragilist. And from what I understand and remember, he talks a lot about it's not about the why, but it's about the how. And that's really interesting because we've all heard it's about why since Simon Sinek kind of coined that phrase and made it super popular. But what Richard talks about is how do we thrive in ambiguous conditions? How do we build new business models for the future? And how do we respond when there's all this market disruption? And we've never had a year as disruptive as this one, that's for sure. But today you've got a topic there on screen we can see already, Richard, which is extended intelligence, complex adaptive organizations. So already my brain is going, ooh, what's that about? What does that mean? Do tell us more, and feel free to introduce yourself or share a bit more about what you're here to do in the world.
Well, I'm actually not going to do that because you've set me up beautifully, even though we didn't talk about this prior, because I'm going to start with why. So yeah, Simon Sinek and why, start with why. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this talk is I have a number of problems with Simon Sinek and people who claim this higher level of consciousness and higher level of purpose in the organizational realm. So I'll start with why and start with Simon. So I have a sort of a love-hate relationship with him. The idealism that we can create organizations in which everyone is connected and doing the work they love and this kind of stuff. I don't think you can stand against that. I think that's fine. But to make the why, the organizational purpose, the center of the human experience, and this is the human experience beyond the organization, is for me quite horrific. That if you can't align yourself with your organizational purpose, you're somehow a failure. And I have a good friend who teaches at Australian Graduate School of Management who asked one of their MBA cohorts, have you found your why? Have you aligned your purpose? And this is obviously a very good university. and 98% of the class had said no, they felt like a failure because they hadn't found their why. So and you can justify, if you sort of go, right, I'm aligned with a purpose, you can justify all kinds of horrific behaviors. And I think it's quite dangerous, this start with why movement and this organizational purpose movement. It reduces purpose to something far, far lesser than it should be. So that's sort of it was a nice segue, AJ, to sort of bring me in. I know we didn't talk about this prior.
I love it. You're already a misbehaviorist.
Yeah. So secondly, and again, so there's another, within the organizational literature, there's another problem I have with sort of the science and spirituality crowd. So there's a group of, or there's a discourse which talks about higher levels of consciousness in organizations. And they talk about sort of moving forward into the next level of consciousness. So the teal organization stuff and tribal leadership, and we're moving into this other level of consciousness. And when I read this stuff, they just seem egocentric. Oh, we've got to this higher level, aren't we incredible? Aren't we? You know, everybody should be as good as us, and they should just listen to us. And I really struggle with that. And not only do I struggle with that, I mean, the tribal leadership book, I've read it, and again, like Sinek's work, it's just not scientifically valid. There's serious problems with it. And alongside that, because I've been interested in sort of this higher consciousness in my own work, I've gone to a number of sort of spiritualist level kind of talks and met people who claim they have a higher level of spirituality, and I find the same problem with them, that they end up sort of almost, oh, I'm better than you because I have this higher, and you can't see the patterns that I can see, and therefore you're not as good as me. And I'm thinking, well, maybe these patterns don't exist. Maybe you're just a borderline conspiracy theorist. So I sort of have, so that's where I'm coming from, my skeptical position. And then over a 24-hour period, and it was roughly when you sent me the invite to talk, I've been listening to, I've just been listening to, because I like to sort of listen to the whole breadth of political discourse. So I've just been listening to Jordan Peterson talk about natural hierarchies. So he's arguing that hierarchies are biological and natural, and everybody should follow a hierarchy. You know, the sort of the divine host, that we automatically have the best at the top, and he talks about competency hierarchies, and that if you have a high IQ, you should rise to the top, and lower IQ people are down the hierarchies. And within 24 hours, I listened to Tyson Yunkaporta, who talked about hierarchies being an experiment, that actually over human history, most societies haven't had hierarchies, and we actually have and so that sort of was a really interesting thing. So, well, do we have hierarchies, or do we have non-hierarchical systems? And I think we probably should have non-hierarchical systems. So there's a body of work that suggests that this current industrial phase is just they call it the Taylorist bathtub. So it's a short experiment within wider organizational history from 100 years, 1,000 years ago till today. So sort of that frames why I wanted to talk about this, and it sort of takes me into the next point. Does that all make sense to you, AJ?
Yeah, and I love that it's challenging everything, you know, because I think far too often, and especially in our short-phased social media lives where people just see something, like it, share it, we don't sit with stuff enough, and we don't question. And Michelle and I, in setting up this Superhuman Summit, the whole idea of science and spirituality and bringing those two topics together was to go, are you actually questioning enough? And we had hoped that we would have speakers that people would disagree with, or at least would go away curious and go, I don't know what I think about that. So already I think you're probably triggering a little of that for people.
I hope so. So I'm going to go back with the next thing with Jordan Peterson's argument that hierarchies are natural. Okay, so basically the argument is that we have competency hierarchies, and those with high IQs get to the top of the hierarchy, and everybody should sort of end up at the level that's natural to them. There's a whole bunch of work in organizations that sort of says the same. But this takes us into the idea of the singularity, where machines or AIs will become the highest IQ parts of society and will then sit at the top of the hierarchy. So the singularity is the moment that that happens. So the humans become the second species on the planet and the AI becomes the first species. And then what happens to humanity once that happens? So this is one vision of the future, which I think is where that hierarchical competency vision gets us to. If, you know, if it only matters who has the highest IQ, then eventually computers will have the highest IQ and we will become a secondary species. So I want to look at a sort of a competing vision of the future, which is the extended intelligence vision. And I have the original Star Trek crew as an example. And this is a much more of a complex adaptive systems approach where you have multiplicities of intelligence merging to explore brave new, strange new worlds and civilizations, etc. And they're reliant on and kept alive by and augmented by a machine, which is the enterprise itself. So if you look at this picture, sort of on the top left, you've got a Scotsman, then you've got a Russian, further to the right, you've got an African American, then you've got a retrospectively gay Japanese guy, and then at the front, you've got sort of, and sadly, the one throwback is the ensign who sort of Kirk's almost his secretary. But the other three at the front, you've got the sort of the doctor, the hybrid alien, and then the captain. And so that sort of, and then they're all in the ship that keeps them alive, and together that they contribute to problem solving. Now, the most interesting thing really is the Dionysian versus Apollonian. So Dionysian is pure emotionality, that you just look at the emotions of everything that's going on and you make emotional decisions. And that's represented by McCoy. Okay, so McCoy is the emotional one. You have to be human, you have to be emotional, etc., etc. The Apollonian is pure rationality, and that's represented by Spock. So Spock is, and emotions don't make any, you can't take any emotional decisions, you can only take rational decisions. And of course, Kirk is between the two and is drawing from both emotional advice and rational advice, plus all of this diverse expertise from the rest of the crew, plus the computer in the enterprise itself to make decisions and to move forwards. Okay, so for me, that is a secondary future where everything integrates into a more complex whole. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to try and look at, have we done that in organizations already or not? Because in most organizations, we have these linear hierarchies that would end up in the singularity. And then do we actually have an alternative history of organizations where we are moving towards this kind of a world? So before I go on, AJ, is that all making sense to you?
Yeah, and I'm thinking even if you drilled into individual organizations, actual departments, sometimes people would say operate as Apollonian or Dionysian, you know, so they might say HR is more in that emotion apart from when they're, you know, doing something that's a trade union issue or something, and that, you know, perhaps IT or finance might be more of the purely rational. So even departments get labeled like that sometimes.
Yeah, well, one of the most interesting, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but one of the most interesting emergent bits of research suggests that all of us initially, whenever there's a complex problem, all of us initially have an emotional reaction, and then we rationalize that emotional reaction when we're trying to be reasonable. And you've got to somehow divide yourself and take yourself away from an emotional reaction. Otherwise, you're becoming immediately biased because you're trying to justify your feelings, and that's problematic.
Absolutely. And it's a very human thing to then draw and gather evidence to say my way's right, you know, or
absolutely.
Yeah. And so that's a product of our conditioning and our environment and everything. And I know in looking at medicine, they say emotions only last in the body 90 seconds. And after that, it's the story we're making up. So, you know, it's then we rationalize to make sense of whatever that emotion was. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's sort of for me, you've perfectly framed where I'm trying to go. And so what I'm looking at the history of organizations is within complexity science, and it's not, it perhaps isn't quite how they talk about it now, but it's how they used to talk about it. They talked about there being complex physical systems and complex adaptive systems. And I'm going to argue here that any organization that exists as at least a complex physical system, but they're not necessarily a complex adaptive system. So hopefully this argument flows and makes sense. So we're going to first look at complex physical systems, and there's four sort of dimensions, and the first one is self-similarity. So this is what self-similarity looks like, okay? So basically you've got a single pattern, the big triangle, and then that pattern divides itself with another pattern, so the same pattern, and then divides again and divides again, and out of it you get an incredibly complex repeating shape. So you've got a self-similarity repeating shape within, and within nature this is what it looks like. So nature has this fractal geometry. Nature recreates itself through the same self-repeating pattern. And then you get these incredibly beautiful natural displays, and this happens throughout nature and throughout the universe, throughout the cosmos. I mean, this is what happens at all levels of reality. The problem that organizations had is humans didn't know how to do it. So for any organization to exist, humans had to solve the problem of self-similarity, and we couldn't do it in the natural way, the fractal way. So we've learned to do it a different way. I'm going to talk about, sort of, for me, the Springfield Armory in 1815 to 1830 was the beginnings of the solution of this problem. So up until sort of from about the mid to late 1700s, people were trying to make guns that had replaceable parts. Because if you're on a battlefield and a part of your gun breaks, you have to be able to replace it quickly, otherwise you get shot. So you had to have these universal interchangeable parts, and it was impossible to do. Now, for our minds today, just not being able to create a part that you could just slot in and they all look the same just seems weird for us. But in those days, so a couple of hundred years ago, they couldn't do it. And it took about 60 years for them to work out how to create these interchangeable parts for guns, so that you sort of begin to control the I guess the alien elements of nature. They were trying to defend their country from the invaders. They were trying to expand across the Midwest. And what happened was Springfield Armory became the center of this incredible innovation where they managed to do it. So you had all of the initial division of labor. So they went from, maybe you had 20 people making a gun to 100 people all making smaller and smaller parts that were more and more exact, so that you could build more and more guns at a greater pace. So you had this whole sort of self-similarity going on and replication through a sort of a division of labor. And the Colonel Lee, who was in charge of Springfield, he recognized that actually this was destroying the craft of the individuals. So he tried to create a society, sort of an integrated system.
Wow.
Where people could have, they could play games, they could go to church, they could get educated beyond what they were doing. So whilst the quality of their work was being reduced, the quality of their life was being increased. So they had all, and there's some paternalistic problems with that, but it's still, this is what he was trying to do. And when you were in the experimental development phase of trying to create one of these pieces of machinery that they hadn't been able to create before, they were trying to speed it up. You didn't get penalized for mistakes. You were still on the same wage. There was no piecemeal. You're not creating it quickly enough that you get paid. You were paid a flat rate and then you would get bonuses and promotions if you actually started to solve the problem, but you would never be penalized. So it didn't matter if you made mistake after mistake. They became the center of a cluster of innovation. So all kinds of people from everywhere would travel in there. They had open source documentation. Everybody could read it. Everybody could contribute to it. And they solved the problem. And they ended up sort of being the dominant force of gun manufacturer in the West, and the source of the westward expansion, because they could create enough weaponry. Now, of course, there's also a problem here because they're killing people. I'm saying that the complex systems equals killing people, which is, for me, that's not really where I want to go. I'm just sort of solving the organizational problem, but the justification of them, what they did, is really problematic. But they were trying to solve this self-similarity in organizations.
But it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I think people think that kind of some of those ideas and concepts are very new and modern in innovation, and they've been around for a very long time. And it reminds me of recently working last year with a manufacturing firm who was losing a lot of staff to the mines, were having staff poached. So they were training them and cross-training them and giving them breadth of experience. And so they had great craftsmanship, and then they were getting poached. And so they started to change their training strategy to give people just narrow tasks to do and only learning to do one or two things, so that then they were less attractive in the marketplace, right? So
that makes you less adaptive as well as an organization.
Crazy.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that this has been 18. You could look at their history and you could apply it today. I mean, it was an innovation cluster. That's exactly how they operated, and they really, all of the great American organizations that when they had the 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition and they wowed the world with their technology, it was this method of manufacturing and innovation that underlied it. And it was this integrated method where all the workers contributed to the development and the furthering of the technology. So this is then sort of 100 years later. This is Ford. And the problem is with Ford, so once you had this incredibly integrated system, so Ford and Taylor in the early 1900s, they started to treat the men who were part of the system not as men, but as cogs in the wheel. Okay, so they were like, you don't have a brain, and you're just a pair of hands to do this minor task. You're not contributing to the overall development of this system. Taylor believed that all of the workers were lazy and stupid, and Ford very much the same, and he was totally distrustful of any of the laborers. So whilst they created self-similarity, they didn't have an integrated system. They now had a divided system where the hierarchy took control. And so then we're looking. So once you sort of this is still a problem nowadays with the self-similarity. It's about doing it like that, but so that it's a long problem that we've been solving. But without it, you don't have an organization. You just have a craft organization. You don't have an industrial one.
Now, we had a question from before, which is kind of jumping back to a few slides ago, but I thought I've got to drop it in now. And that was from Simon. So, hey, Simon. And he said, Richard, do you see Taylorism as purely an Apollonian approach to leadership?
Very much, yeah. So you're basically just going, right, here's the Taylorism would be an Apollonian model. Yeah, here's the rationality, here's the science, forget any emotion, remove any of that and just go boom and then design it. So absolutely.
And Michelle is commenting. Hi, Michelle. She's one of our speakers for day 3. So g'day to you. Thanks for tuning in. She says, definitely nature has the answers and science moves too far away. A return to nature and living rich, full lives.
Absolutely. Yes. So there's a way, we have to recognize that what we've created is an artificial, and I'll get to sort of trying to create a much more natural way of doing things. So the second challenge is once you've done this, you're then looking at scaling, and what in an organization needs to scale. Well, obviously you have to be able to scale products. You have to be able to scale the organization itself where the products are made. But really the key thing is you have to be able to scale information flow. That's the lifeblood of any organization, is the information as it goes between everything. So the etymology of organization is the human body. So it's the collection of organs in a human body that drives a more complex system. And this is obviously what it looks like. And when you have a scaling pattern, as you can see, you'll have it's exactly the same as this fractal geometry. Is you've got these core central pieces where major blood vessels flow, and then they break up into smaller and smaller repeating pieces. And that's roughly what needs to happen in an organization as well. You've got some core pieces of information flow, but they need to get to every part of the organization. So what you find is that you found a power law of curve. So you'll have a certain amount which will be so the core the core information flow will be double the size of the next level, and then you're breaking it up into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, and this stops the organization or the organism from overheating, because you can't just do blanket communication to everybody, which seems to be happening in this age of COVID. It's just like, here's the communication, boom, boom, boom. It doesn't work like that. It's got to fragment and filter, and you've got to get the requisite amount for you to do your job, not everything. And then so this takes me into then, okay, so when they were trying to scale organizations themselves, this is the first ever organizational chart, which looks upside down from standard, which is Daniel McCullum's 1855 US railroad chart. And it looks incredibly organic compared to what we would see now. But at the bottom, you have sort of central headquarters. and then you, or sort of the board and this kind of stuff, and then you go into the sort of the beginnings of the organization. And the aim is that you can recreate, again, self-similarity. You recreate throughout the organization the same models across across the country, which is the first time that anyone had tried to do it with the US railroad system at that scale. So that every part of the railroad system ran itself the same way. So that's the self-similarity across the system. It's called the M-form organizational pattern, and this is the dominant pattern today. The problem, again, with McCallum is he was quite a strict Calvinist. So he believed people down. He believed in sort of a predetermined determinism, where if you're going to go to heaven, you were rewarded on earth as you were in heaven. So you would be higher up these charts, and if you were going to hell, you would be lower down these things, and you would be a deviant, and you would be lazy again and causing problems. So
oh my goodness.
Yes, I know. It's
it adds new meaning to an org chart. Oh
doesn't it just? Yeah. So there was a lack of trust. As the further you went down, the more you were seen to be deviant, and you could see that why 50 years later, people like Ford and Taylor, because this was 60 years after this, were perceiving the workers that way. They were deviants rather than integrated. Whereas 50 years prior, they were integrated to the system. Okay, so once you sort of got this, and perhaps one other thing happens, that this is very easy to do in small startups with sort of strong cultures. That's easy to create this flow of information. It's very difficult to do in large organizations. For me, the cultural language shortcuts the information flow. So you sort of go, oh, we all understand what we're doing, and this commitment to the culture and the vision and the mission shortcuts it. In a large organization, we know from research that actually this cultural commitment stops growth and stops communication, because everyone's playing to the cultural demands rather than saying what needs to be said. And in a complex organization, there's a wealth of stuff that needs to be said. Whereas perhaps in a small startup doing a niche kind of work, there's nowhere near as much that needs to be said, so that you can all just shortcut your communications and grow rapidly. So we're then looking at networks, which again, how do you then scale massively? So everyone, the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, I don't know if you've come across this. So there's the idea in networks, the 6 degrees of separation. So within the Hollywood industry, they basically play a game called the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, and everybody's ever made a film ever is within 6 degrees of having acted with Kevin Bacon at some stage in their lives. So there's a website where you can play around with it. But the aim is that if you're creating a network, you can through the central point of the network, you can then persuade other people in the network to buy stuff or to do stuff or to be part of stuff, and you can begin to create value through that scaling. So Henry Ford's network really was around the $5 wage. So the network was, he was hugely looked down upon by the other capitalists at the time for creating a $5 wage. Because they were, you're going to create lazy men. They're not going to work as hard because you're paying them this kind of money. And the reason he wasn't altruistic why he did it because he had such a high turnover and he was trying to get men to stay in the factory. But what happened with this is that he created across the media of the States these nodes where people were going, this is incredible. He's paying people this money. So the information flew across the media that he was this altruistic modernist, and everybody should be buying his cars and etc. through. And again, he said it was the best marketing thing he'd ever done, even though there was no altruism in it at all initially. It was just to try and keep people in the factory. Gmail had a very similar thing. I don't know if you can remember the Gmail beta, but basically you were special. If you were invited by a friend to be part of the Gmail beta, you were special, and then you would invite other friends within your network, so that one invite became 10 invites, and everybody felt special and part of something, and etc. And then that would scale across the network would scale it, and you suddenly had a product or a company. And then you have dynamics, and dynamics is the most interesting. So once you've done these first 3, you actually have an organization. Okay, you've got self-similarity, you've got information flows, you've got a way of scaling across a network, and so you're no longer a craft industry, you're actually established.
Yeah.
And then we have dynamics. Now, dynamics for me is it's the shift from the complex physical system into the complex adaptive system. So dynamics is when you look at the organization itself and you only look at the current pattern, can you predict its future? You don't need to know anything about its past. You only need to look at the current state of the organization, and by looking at that, you can predict its future. And we experience this in organizations all the time. So I'll go through a few examples. So the first one here, this is what is called a whale or a Leviathan graph. And this is what the big tier 1 consultancies would do. So what they basically say, on the left-hand side, you've got an organization and 20% of the business here. So the 80-20 rule again, 20% of your business makes 80% of your profits. So on the left-hand side of the graph, the strategy consultants have identified those parts of that part of your business. You then got about 60%, which you're just breaking even on, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the bottom, 20% of your business, which is now cutting into your profits, you're actually losing money on it. So a big tier 1 consultancy trying to do strategy work with you will look at this pattern and they'll go, right, here's the 20% that we can get rid of. Okay, here's the stuff that's costing you, so we get rid of that, and then your profits will rise. Okay, so this is a standard tier 1 consultancy model, and it's been going on for 50 years.
Yeah, and it's that whole idea. They come in every year and say, what's that 20%, cull it, get rid of it. Yeah.
Okay, so again, it's this sort of hierarchical kind of, we're top down, rational, this is what it's all about. But what actually happens, and this is a piece of rebar. So I don't know if you've come across Clayton Christensen's model of how these organizations get disrupted. And the steel industry is the classic example. So I'll just go back a slide. So the steel industries, the 20% of their business that they weren't making any money on was rebar.
Right.
So you had the integrated steel mills they were quite happy to get rid of rebar to the mini mills when the mini mills popped up. Because the mini mill, they go, oh, here's all this business we want to get rid of. The mini mills make rebar. They get rid of all the low margin stuff. They start to maximize their profits. Isn't it great? The mini mills then further innovate, and now they can make higher level rebar. So they eat into the next step. But now that's the bottom 20%. So they give that up. And then the mini mills be able to make structured steel because they've innovated. But now that's the bottom 20%. So the integrated steel mills give that up and they just make sheet steel. And eventually the mini mills start making sheet steel again, and that's it. There's nothing else to defend. So slowly this adaptive, innovative organization eats into you from the bottom up. So the argument, while you're giving money to the strategists to try and to get rid of that, it's actually risking your long-term adaptability and your ability to survive against these agile players. So this is something you need to be very wary of if you're constantly going down that route.
It's really interesting because it also reminds me of nature, and when man interferes in nature and introduces a species maybe to cull some of another species, and then that species adapts and starts taking over and kills off others. And
Yeah, rabbits in Australia, yes.
Yeah.
So that's pattern 1, which is the tier 1 consultancies. You have pattern 2, which is the auditors. Okay, so here's just an audit report. So you get an auditor in every year, and of course the auditor, for lots of auditors are a loss-leading part of the business, and they want consultancy coming out of it to fix the organization. And this is where best practice comes in. So this is the kind of thing that you would see, everyone at the end of an audit, well, we've got to adopt the best practices because the auditors have said that we're not actually at the level that all of our other businesses is. And that's what you end up with, this kind of, we're just creating mediocrity. We're not creating anything. And so that basically they're just, again, it's the self-similarity. They're just trying to create it, but according to external requirements rather than internal requirements. And then again, you can see the loss of trust, the further loss of trust in the developmental and the operations team who are doing it in a specific way because it's no longer best practice. And then you get the consultancies in to come in and make it best practice again, et cetera, et cetera. So again, you can look at this loss of trust way back to the Taylorist kind of McCallum kind of stuff as well. And then finally you have the hockey stick curve, which we all horribly understand because of COVID, where you're looking at the level of the exponential growth. And this is what investors look for. Okay, so they look for this pattern of exponential growth. And then if they can see it, then they will give you money. So here we've got 3 examples. We've got tier 1 consultancies, auditors and investors, 2 of whom are trying to find problems in your patterns so that they can take money from you and fix it, and 1 of whom who's trying to see this kind of growth, so they will give you money so that they can help you grow and adapt, etc., etc. So you can understand why this is far more energizing than the other 2, and why perhaps lots of people want to work for smaller organizations and startups, because this is a really exciting pattern to go towards rather than the others. But all 3 of them are indicators of dynamics. If you look at the pattern and you say, well, here's your future, here's your future, here's your future, you don't have to believe the predictions of the future, but that's what's going on. Okay, so I want to suggest that lots of this is problematic, and that actually there's a different pattern that we need to be looking at and that we don't. And that is the behavioral pattern. Okay, so nobody looks hard at human behavior when you're looking at at predicting of the future of the organization. Okay, and this will take me into the complex adaptive system. So do we actually have, can we look at and find complex adaptive behaviors in the organization? And by finding that, and by complex adaptive behaviors, I mean, this is the higher levels of consciousness and the extended intelligences that we're looking for. If we can see evidence of that, then we could predict that the organization is going to succeed. If we don't see any evidence of that, we will predict that the organization is going to fail. So this is I recognise I've got about 11 minutes to finish this, so I'll have to go quite quickly.
It's fascinating.
So the first one is autonomy. Okay. So again, we go back to Ford. So Ford did not like autonomy in his workers. In fact, he just trusted any worker who showed autonomy at all. So he said, every time I come with a pair of hands, they come with a brain. So the brain is the autonomy, and he would punish workers for talking to each other. He would punish them for coming to him with ideas, all kinds of stuff. We look at jobs. So jobs is quote, which is just as famous. It doesn't make sense to hire smart people and tell them what to do. We sort of let them tell us what to do. So you're creating people, you're hiring people who are good, and you're trying to give them a level of autonomy. Now, I think he's trying to hire the smartest people in the world. But most people in knowledge work understand the work they're going to do, and you need to start trusting them. Okay, so they're maybe not having an IQ of 150. But within the collective intelligence unit, that doesn't matter, because the group itself, or the team itself, if you take the team as the unit of analysis, they're able to solve problems at a level of IQ far beyond any of the individual levels of IQ, as long as the communication patterns are good between them. This is sort of what it looks like.
Absolutely, which is what people like Patrick Lencioni, that have their 5 behaviors or 5 dysfunctions of an effective team, always say that trust is at that bedrock.
Yeah, and absolutely.
Then you start getting people who actually have disagreements and things like that, which creates better results and outcomes. But you have to have trust first. Yeah. Yeah.
So you're trying to sort of create a small world networking within the team, that you've got these really efficient levels of communication between the team. You've got trust within the team, so all kinds of things get communicated rather than just the same stuff. And then over time, you might have people who go into who have these extended networks, and they're getting information from other networks and bringing it into the team, so that you're not experiencing entropy, where the team is just a unit. So you've got the team as a tribe, but the team is also part of an extended intelligence network, so that you've got both things going on simultaneously and both add value. So you're trying to create, and the team itself is then involved in nonlinearity. So what the team is trying to do is it's in an exploration mode. It's trying to explore its environment. I might stay here at the moment. It's trying to explore its environment. And if you have multiple teams all exploring the same environment, all of them will come up with, and to go back to the Kirk-Spock analogy, they will have bounded rationality, partly emotional, partly biased, but partly they're trying to sense make. So 20 teams exploring the same environment will come up with 20 possible solutions and experiences and explanations of that environment. All right, and there you've now got something quite interesting. The problem most organizations have is they don't allow that. Now this is a wonderful dual image. On the right you have a melting pot. So the aim for most organizations is you get all these very interesting people and you throw them into a melting pot, and they all become this sort of brown muck, and everyone behaves the same way. On the left is a mosaic, where you actually enable the diversity within the mosaic. So within the literature, you've got melting pot cultures and you've got mosaic cultures. And mosaic cultures, you have some levels of coherence, but you also have all this diversity, and you create this multiplicity of patterns. And that's what you're trying to do with the nonlinear teams and the bounded rationality, here are all the possible routes forward.
I love that analogy. I've never seen it described like that before. Love it.
Okay, it's reasonably established, but yeah, nobody in the stuff I read anyway, which I recognise is very narrow to me rather than to the wider world. And then, so this is what nonlinearity then looks like. So you end up with all these possible ways to the river, for the river to reach the sea. But actually, it's not a straight line. You're moving off into all kinds of different directions. You're getting different tributaries come and join you. Eventually, you will get to the sea. But the exploration becomes the right exploration rather than just a straight line. Okay, so and again, all of these. So you'll see all of the smaller teams. You know, when their way of getting to the river becomes non-obvious and it's not going to happen, they can join the bigger river and become part of a larger team that does seem to be working. So you get this merging into a larger pathway from these multiplicities at the start point.
And also that concept of path of least resistance in that way, depending on the environment that they're in as well, you know, or the removal of obstacles that might be like a rock in the river that allows it to flow. Yeah,
absolutely. So as you go, so you might have 20 teams of 4 people initially, but you end up with 4 teams of 20 people where all of the resources are coming in and these pathways are becoming clearer and clearer, and then you have enough slack in the team so different people can carry the weights at different time as it becomes more complex and as you're getting closer to the goal.
Someone on Facebook that's just commented, Duana said, as a Canadian, I always say that's the difference between Canada, which is more like a mosaic, and the USA, which is more
that's part of the literature suggests that Canada and USA are two different nation levels that you could use to differentiate between the two.
And I love Simon's comment. The melting pot is like putting a salad in a blender. The reason you made a salad is to appreciate diversity. Great point.
Absolutely, yeah. So we're now moving into, so you've got these rivers and we're looking at so we're looking at these emergent pathways. And initially, I've got a blank slide. No, I haven't. There's an owl. So initially it looks like this. This is a burrowing owl. Okay, so an owl comes out of a burrow and peeks around to see if it's safe. And of course, I've used an owl because an owl stands for wisdom. So at all levels of emergence, there's possible wisdom emerging, but it's very unsafe and it's very, it needs to protect itself, etc., etc. So the owl, so if you look at a burrowing thing, you'll have all these little owls popping their heads up and having a look around and emerging from the burrows, and potentially one of them will be wise. And we've got to find what that wisdom is, and we've got to be able to experiment. So we've got to be able to stop non-wise emergence, and we've got to be able to amplify wise emergence. And so this is my amplification. We have to work out how to turn it up to 11. Okay, so when you've got something incredible happening, we have to be able to recognize it. So this is, again, the communication has to be great. You've got to know what's going on, both horizontally and vertically, and throw resources at a solution in which it becomes clearer and clearer that it's working. And then this is sort of what that looks like ultimately. So I've sort of explored the collective intelligence. So this is the group of 4 people maybe that's exploring, and the bounded rationality, and they're emerging. And then you move into an extended intelligence network. So then you go into where the technology adds further information into the collective. So you're not just reliant on the bounded humans, but you can then go out beyond your little tribe and find further stuff which is beyond the capacity of any specific human or tribe, and bring it into your system and then re-rationalize it and re-experiment it with it, etc., etc. And then you move forward as a collective in which the machines and the humans are collective together. So again, you can see why I'm using the enterprise and the crew as a wider metaphor. So you're no longer locked just into your mini team. You're constantly probing further environments to find out if you can add to the overall collective as you go forward. And ultimately, this is your goal. How do you become an adaptive organization? So one of my business partners, he tries to persuade every executive who asks for agile that they're actually asking for this. Okay, you're not asking to become an agile organization, you're asking to become an adaptive organization. And he co-wrote a lot of what I've just gone through. I mean, a lot of it is coming from him. John Dobbin, if you look for him on LinkedIn, he's the mathematician. I'm not. So he actually understands the maths of complex adaptive systems, and he can do all the equations, etc. So ultimately, you're just trying to become a chameleon.
Yeah.
You're trying to become something that can adapt to whatever environment it is and survive and thrive in whatever environment it is. Multiple colors, multiple changes, etc., etc., etc. And so this is the final slide. So I think I've done well to get it in 45 minutes. So this for me is where we're trying to go. So we think the future of work is not the science of business administration. And now this is paradoxical for me because I teach for a business school. So I teach business administration, but it's the wrong way of thinking. If I'm right about everything I've gone through, the science of business administration and the hierarchies and the non-integrated behaviors, etc., is problematic. Complexity science helps us solve that. Now, problematically, the science of human behavior that is in organization is largely behavioral science, so behavioral economics and a bit of neuroscience, and I don't think it's enough. So I think we actually need the deep, broad and wide understanding of what it means to be human. We need to bring in all of the social sciences and the behavioral sciences, and we need to look at what do they all tell us about the richness of being a human, and how do we integrate that with business practices and designing a better world for all ultimately, because if organizations are either going to create a better world or a worse world. And this is and that then, to go back to my initial point, where you only find your why in the organization. Now, the why is all of this broad richness of your life, of which the organization is a part, and it becomes part of wider communities and wider practices, etc. So that's where I hope we're going. But I think, and I've tried to outline a lot of complex stuff, but what I've tried to do is use common terminologies and common examples to try and make it understandable. I don't know how well I've succeeded. It's the first time I've tried in a public environment. So there you go.
Oh, I think it's awesome. And I'm just going to put an invite out to anyone who's here in Zoom or in Facebook land to pop your question below in the next kind of 2 minutes. If you have a question and you would like that answered by Dr. Richard Claydon. That's been exceptional and really stimulating. And actually, I think you covered a lot of ground in 45 minutes.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Michelle's saying, yes, what it means to be human. And I know for me, even on my LinkedIn profile myself, I say I think business is one of the most underestimated opportunities to solve social, technological, environmental issues and challenges in the world. And we don't look enough at the whole complex system, and we don't think about work being part of life and those sorts of things. And I love Richard Branson once said, when someone asked him about life-work balance, he said, it's all just living. I don't understand, why are you compartmentalizing, and I think what you're describing is the way of the future. But how wed are we to the structures of the past, and how much they're reinforced through every day and through what is, I guess, profitable or what is rewarded or seen as the right thing. And that organizational structure of heaven and hell as well, all for me.
Yeah, I think sadly we are wedded to it because we've been teaching it in business schools for 100 years. I mean, there are beginnings of a change, but again, we're in emergence at the moment. We don't quite know what the future of business education would look like, and there are a number, including the program I work for, which are trying to experiment.
Michelle Crone has just said business has been quick to change, to adapt, our ability to cope with the stresses and the balance of work and life and family. And I agree with that, Michelle, in that COVID actually has brought up a lot of that, in that people started working from home more, and organizations all globally got forced to adapt in lots of ways, didn't they, very quickly? And in no way could we have made that change happen globally without probably the pandemic.
I think, yeah, I mean, I look at that as a three-stage process for the organization's adaptivity during COVID. So stage one was, oh my God, we've got to fix this now, or we die. We need to suddenly do years of digital transformation in months, otherwise the organization collapses. That's stage one. Stage two is all the tough decisions to be made in terms of how do we survive long term. So this is the furloughing and laying people off and restructures, etc. Some of which has been done well, some of it's been done badly, and that we'll see what the ripples are for lots of organisations going forward. Stage 3 is how do we emerge out of COVID stronger than we were when we went in, and that really is where you have to look back at the learnings of the first stage and go, well, okay, how do we recreate that as an ongoing practice to become an adaptive organisation in the future?
And interestingly, just had a comment from Ross. Thanks for tuning in as well, Ross. And he said, great to hear an answer to singularity and ASI. I think we need to empower humans at the same time we're working on ANI and AGI because humans have so much potential. Sorry for all acronyms.
I agree. I mean, I think the way I look at it is, if it can be automated, you're not automating someone out of a job. You're trying to give them space to be more creative and to be more valuable. And then the other technology is, well, how do you augment that? So once we're creating opportunities for people to be more valuable, etc., how do we augment the opportunities for them to be so? So you're looking at 2 types of technology: the automation and the augmentation, and recognize what both can do to drive us into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been a delight and pleasure. We are honoured that you broke new ground with us today on the Science and Spirituality Summit. And I love how you've meshed that all together. And you really have a great way of bringing lots of complex and diverse thinking and narrowing it down and boiling it down into some great analogies and things that we can relate to as dear little humans that we are. So thank you for doing that for us, Dr. Claydon. And it's always a pleasure. I know you're great on LinkedIn, so if people are looking to check you out and find out more, please go and befriend him there and be sure to have some stimulating conversations. Thank you for being our second speaker here on the summit today.
Absolute pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Awesome. And for everyone who is watching and wanting to come in live, we're crossing across to America next, and we're going to be speaking to Enrique Feldman. And he is a delightful human who I've had the pleasure of interviewing before for my podcast. And he's going to talk a bit about how to live with purpose and awakening our superhuman spirit. So some nice segues there happening. And interestingly, with each summit, we've had all these diversity of speakers, but we always start to see breadcrumbs appearing. So it's been great having everyone on. Thanks for all your chats and comments. Everyone's saying thanks very much, Richard, for all of your input today. Have a great afternoon or the rest of the day there in Hong Kong. Thanks, everyone. See you on the next speaker.
Bye-bye.
Bye.